Title: The Shed Rebellion. Emily Carter had always dreamed of a fresh start. After years of cramped apartments and noisy city streets, the quiet suburb of Willow Grove felt like a slice of paradise. The moving truck rumbled to a stop in front of her new house, a modest two-story with a neatly trimmed lawn and a wide backyard that stretched out like an invitation. She stepped out of her car, breathing in the crisp March air, and smiled. This was it, her chance to build the peaceful life she'd always wanted. The neighborhood seemed to agree with her vision. Rows of identical houses lined the street, their beige and gray exteriors blending into a picture of suburban harmony. Kids rode bikes in lazy circles, and an elderly man waved from his porch as he watered his tulips. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen, and that was exactly what Emily was counting on. She spent the first day unpacking, stacking boxes in the living room, and imagining where her bookshelves would go. The backyard, though, was where her real plans lay. She'd always wanted a shed, a small, practical space for her gardening tools, and maybe a workbench for tinkering. Nothing fancy, just a little corner of her own. She'd even brought the blueprints with her, sketched out on a napkin during a late-night coffee run back in the city. Now, standing on her new lawn, she could see it taking shape. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, a sharp knock interrupted her thoughts. Emily opened the door to find a woman standing on her porch, arms crossed and a tight smile plastered across her face. She was in her late 40s, with a sleek bob haircut and a sweater that screamed, "I'm in charge." In her hands was a binder so thick it could have doubled as a doorstop. "Hi there," the woman said, her voice syrupy sweet. "I'm Laura Bennett, head of the Willow Grove Homeowners Association. Welcome to the neighborhood." Emily blinked, caught off guard by the sudden formality. "Oh, thanks. I'm Emily Carter. Just moved in today." "I noticed." Laura's eyes flicked past Emily, scanning the half-unpacked living room like she was conducting an inspection. "I wanted to drop by and make sure you're up to speed on our community guidelines." She thrust the binder forward, forcing Emily to take it. "We take our standards seriously around here. Keeps everything pristine." Emily hefted the binder, its weight surprising her. "Wow, this is thorough." "Oh, it's all necessary," Laura chirped, her smile widening just enough to show teeth. "We don't tolerate rule breakers in Willow Grove. Keeps the property values up, you know." "Right. Good to know." Emily forced a polite nod, already sensing the undertone in Laura's words. This wasn't a welcome visit, it was a warning. She flipped through the first few pages of the binder, skimming over rules about grass height, mailbox colors, and something about approved fence materials. It was overwhelming, but she kept her expression neutral. No point in ruffling feathers on day one. Laura lingered on the porch, her gaze drifting toward the stack of moving boxes by the door. "Settling in okay?" "Yeah, so far so good," Emily said, shifting the binder to one arm. "Just figuring out where everything goes." "Well, if you need anything, I'm right across the street." Laura pointed to a pristine house with a perfectly manicured lawn and a flagpole sporting the HOA logo. "I keep an eye on things around here." "I'll bet you do," Emily muttered under her breath, then quickly added, "Thanks, Laura. I appreciate it." Laura's smile didn't falter, but her eyes narrowed slightly, like she'd caught the sarcasm and filed it away for later. "Enjoy your evening, Emily. We'll be seeing more of each other, I'm sure." As Laura turned and marched back across the street, Emily closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling. "Okay, that was intense," she said to the empty room. She dropped the binder onto the coffee table with a thud and shook her head. An overzealous HOA president wasn't the end of the world. Annoying, sure, but manageable. She'd dealt with worse neighbors in the city. The next morning, Emily woke up early, eager to tackle her backyard project. She pulled out the HOA rulebook, reluctantly, and spread it across the kitchen table next to a mug of coffee. If she was going to build her shed, she'd do it by the book. No sense giving Laura an excuse to come knocking again. The guidelines were as strict as she'd expected. Sheds couldn't exceed 10 feet in height, had to be at least 5 feet from the property line, and needed to be painted in an approved neutral tone. There were even rules about the type of wood and the slope of the roof. But as she read, a small victory emerged. Nothing in the binder required prior approval for a shed under a certain size. Hers fit the criteria perfectly. Checkmate, Laura, Emily said with a grin, sipping her coffee. She spent the rest of the day sketching out her plans in detail, double-checking measurements against the rules. By the time the weekend rolled around, she'd ordered the materials and cleared a spot in the backyard. It was happening. Her little shed was coming to life. What Emily didn't realize, as she hammered the first nail into place a week later, was that she'd just lit the fuse on a neighborhood war. Across the street, Laura Bennett watched from her window, her lips pressed into a thin line. The shed might have been within the rules, but to Laura, it was a challenge, a threat to her carefully controlled kingdom. And she wasn't about to let it stand. Emily spent the next week building her shed, her backyard buzzing with the sound of hammering and the smell of fresh-cut wood. She'd triple-checked the HOA guidelines. Her shed was 9 feet tall, 6 feet from the fence, and painted a muted beige that matched her house. It was perfect, simple, functional, and undeniably legal. She stood back one afternoon, wiping sweat from her brow, and admired her handiwork. It wasn't much, but it was hers. That evening, Laura appeared at her door, her face a mask of barely contained outrage. "You didn't get approval for that," she snapped, jabbing a finger toward the shed. Emily raised an eyebrow. "I read the rules, Laura. No approval needed for a shed this size." Laura's smile twitched. "As HOA president, I decide what impacts our aesthetic. That thing's an eyesore." Emily crossed her arms. "It's beige. Like my house. If you've got a problem, take it to the board." Laura's eyes flashed, but she turned on her heel and stormed off. Emily sighed, sensing this was only the beginning. Across the street, neighbors peeked through blinds, whispering about the brewing storm. 2 nights later, Emily was halfway through a slice of pizza when red and blue lights flooded her yard. She stepped outside to find 2 police officers standing by her shed, one scribbling in a notepad, the other looking bored. Laura stood beside them, arms crossed, practically glowing with triumph. "She built an illegal structure," Laura declared. "No permit, no authorization. It's ruining property values." The taller officer sighed. "Ma'am, it's a shed." Laura gasped. "It's an unauthorized monstrosity. If you don't act, I'll escalate this to the county." Emily couldn't help but laugh. "Laura, did you call 911 over my shed?" Laura's nostrils flared. "It's the start of anarchy. Next, it's neon houses and lawlessness." The shorter officer rubbed his temple. "This is a civil matter, not criminal. We're not arresting anyone over a shed." He snapped his notepad shut, and they left, leaving Laura fuming. She glared at Emily. "This isn't over." Emily grinned. "Hope not. It's getting fun." Laura called an emergency HOA meeting, transforming the community clubhouse into a makeshift courtroom. Emily walked in to find Laura at the head of a long table, flanked by board members: Richard, an older man with glasses; Helen, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s; and Paul, a weary retiree. Laura tapped a stack of papers. "This resident built an unauthorized structure without approval." Emily leaned back in her chair. "I followed every guideline. No approval required." Laura's eyes narrowed. "It disrupts the neighborhood's aesthetic." Richard flipped through the rulebook. "It meets size and color standards." "Laura, what's the issue?" Laura bristled. "It's visually unappealing." Helen sighed. "It's not against the rules." Emily smirked. "So you just don't like it?" Laura's composure slipped, but she doubled down. "The HOA will decide." The room buzzed with tension as Emily sensed cracks in Laura's control. Emily spent the night before the meeting digging through HOA records online. She struck gold. Aerial photos showed Laura's backyard housed a massive pink shed, twice the size of hers, unapproved and glaringly against regulations. At the meeting, as Laura ranted about aesthetics, Emily slid the photos across the table. "Let's talk about your shed, Laura." The room fell silent. Laura's face reddened as Richard frowned at the images. "Is this accurate?" Laura snatched a photo. "It's grandfathered in." Emily grinned. "No record of that in the files." Helen crossed her arms. "Karen, did you get approval?" Laura sputtered. "This isn't about me." Richard sighed. "It is now. We can't enforce rules unfairly." The board voted. Emily's shed stayed, and Laura stormed out, humiliated but plotting her next move. For a few days, silence reigned. Emily enjoyed her shed, storing tools and sipping coffee on her porch. Neighbors stopped by, Mike from next door shared how Laura once fined him for a crooked mailbox, while Sarah across the street laughed about her illegal birdhouse. Emily realized Laura's tyranny had worn everyone thin. Then, a letter arrived from the HOA. Laura demanded a secondary compliance review of Emily's shed, citing vague aesthetic clauses. Emily laughed over her coffee. Laura wasn't done, she was desperate. That afternoon, Emily spotted Laura pacing her porch, phone in hand, scheming. The neighborhood watched, waiting for the next salvo in this absurd war. Laura marched to Emily's house with Richard and Helen, clipboard and tape measure in hand. "Compliance inspection," she barked. Emily waved them in. "Knock yourselves out." Laura measured every inch of the shed, height, width, distance, all perfect. She pointed at the foundation. Uneven ground. Structural risk. Helen rolled her eyes. "It's a shed, not a skyscraper." Emily grinned. "I've got a contractor's report if you want it." Laura's jaw tightened. "Unnecessary." Then Helen pulled out a folder. "Laura, your shed violates 3 rules. No approvals, no variances." Paul nodded. 2 weeks to fix it, or fines." Laura froze, speechless, then stomped off. Emily waved. "Take your time." Workers arrived at Laura's house the next day, dismantling her pink shed as she paced, furious. She sent Emily a lawyer's letter claiming unfair targeting by the HOA and went door to door with flyers, ranting about Emily's chaos. Most neighbors trashed the flyers, some laughed in her face. Mike told Emily, "She's been a dictator too long." By week's end, Laura's campaign flopped. The board upheld Emily's shed and Laura's fines. Defeated, Laura glared at Emily from her porch. "Enjoy your shed." Emily grinned, planning to add fairy lights. Laura scoffed and retreated, her empire crumbling. A "for sale" sign sprouted in Laura's yard, but not before she left a 6-foot red sign. "Good luck without me, idiots." Richard sighed. "Mature." Helen smirked. "She's delusional." Laura snapped at them from her porch, then drove off as neighbors clapped. A spontaneous, joyful roar. That night, Emily hosted a barbecue by her shed. Mike raised a beer. To Laura, gone but never forgotten. Laughter echoed as the neighborhood exhaled years of tension. Willow Grove transformed without Laura. Barbecues multiplied, kids played freely, and the HOA relaxed. Emily added fairy lights and a flower bed to her shed, a quiet victory. At a final gathering, Helen toasted, "To new beginnings." Paul chuckled, "And sheds that don't start wars." Emily smiled, watching the glow of her shed. Laura had ruled through control, but her exit proved the neighborhood didn't need her. It thrived without her. Peace, at last, was the real triumph.